My neighbor left me a cryptic note before they vanished without a trace. They say you never really know your neighbors, but I thought I knew mine well enough. Mr. Grayson had lived next door for as long as I could remember. A quiet, solitary man in his late 60s with a penchant for gardening and classical music. We didn't talk much, just exchanged pleasantries when we bumped into each other in the driveway, or when I brought back his misdelivered mail. But one day, everything changed. It was a chilly autumn morning when I noticed something strange. A single envelope had been slid under my front door. It was plain, unmarked, and sealed with a piece of old wax. At first, I thought it might have been junk mail, but then I saw the handwriting. Scrawled across the front in shaky letters was my name. Inside was a note. It was brief but chilling. If something happens to me, don't trust anyone. The answers are in the garden. Burn this after reading. The note shook me to my core. Mr. Grayson had always seemed so ordinary, just a quiet old man who spent his days tending to roses and hydrangeas. But this cryptic message hinted at something far darker. If something happens to me, don't trust anyone. Those words replayed in my head as I paced the living room, clutching the paper. I debated whether to call the police, but what would I even say? There was no crime, no evidence, just an ominous note from a man who might have simply lost his mind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Against my better judgment, I decided to visit his house. His porch light was on, even though it was mid-morning and the curtains were drawn tight. I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and called his name. Nothing. I tried peeking through the window, but the thick drapes blocked my view. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the porch. A faint trail of dirt, leading from the steps to the side yard. My heart raced as I followed it. Around the corner, the dirt path led to his garden, a sprawling patch of perfectly manicured greenery. But one area stood out, a section of freshly turned soil near the back fence. It didn't match the rest of the garden. The earth was loose and uneven, as if someone had hurriedly dug it up and covered it again. My pulse quickened as I stared at the freshly turned soil. Something about it felt off. The edges were too neat, the earth too dark, like it hadn't been there long. Mr. Grayson was meticulous about his garden, yet this patch seemed rushed, careless. I glanced around to make sure no one was watching and grabbed the small gardening spade lying nearby. My hands trembled as I began digging. The soil gave way easily, and within minutes I hit something solid. At first I thought it was a rock, but as I brushed away the dirt, I saw it was a wooden box. The box was old, with rusted metal hinges and a faint smell of decay. My stomach churned as I lifted it from the ground. It wasn't heavy, but it felt wrong, like it was holding something that shouldn't have been disturbed. I hesitated, then forced the lid open. Inside was a small stack of photographs, yellowed with age, and a leather-bound journal. The photos were black and white, showing a much younger Mr. Grayson standing with two other men. They all wore grim expressions, and behind them was an unfamiliar building, a factory or warehouse maybe. Scrawled on the back of one photo were the words, Project Eterna, 1984. The journal's pages were filled with dense handwriting, diagrams, and what looked like chemical formulas. Flipping through it, one phrase kept repeating, the experiment must never be completed. Back in my living room, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the journal. The words seemed to leap off the pages, each one darker and more cryptic than the last. The first few entries were ordinary enough, notes about work, schedules, and what appeared to be lab experiments. But as I read further, the tone shifted. Phrases like unintended consequences and irreversible outcomes began to appear. One entry caught my attention immediately. August 12, 1984. The compound is unstable. Prolonged exposure leads to changes. We must destroy it before it's too late. But Grayson doesn't agree. He thinks we can contain it. He's wrong. I stared at the page, my hands trembling. Grayson? Could this be referring to Mr. Grayson? My quiet, unassuming neighbor was involved in some kind of dangerous experiment? As I flipped further, the entries grew more frantic, the handwriting more erratic. The diagrams, once clean and precise, became messy, chaotic scribbles. One particularly disturbing entry read, September 3rd, 1984. It's spreading. The containment unit is failing. Grayson insists we keep going, but the others are starting to panic. I saw it move today. God help us. The next few pages were blank, as if the author had stopped mid-thought. but tucked between the pages was something else, a folded piece of paper, brittle with age. Carefully, I unfolded it. It was a map, a crudely drawn blueprint of what appeared to be an underground facility. The words Eterna Lab were scrawled at the top, along with coordinates. I typed the coordinates into my phone. My blood ran cold when I realized the location wasn't far from here, just a few miles outside of town, near an abandoned industrial park. The coordinates haunted me. I knew I shouldn't go, but the pull of the mystery was too strong. What was Project Eterna? What did Mr. Grayson have to do with it? And why had he left me that note? I convinced myself that if I could find answers, maybe I could help him, wherever he was. The industrial park was exactly as I'd imagined, abandoned and eerie. Rusted fences surrounded the perimeter, and weeds pushed through the cracked pavement. The air was thick with the smell of damp metal and decay. At the center of the site was a large, decrepit building. Its windows were shattered, and the paint had peeled away in jagged strips, revealing the steel beneath. As I approached, I noticed a faded sign above the entrance, Eterna Research Facility. The front door was ajar, creaking on its hinges with every gust of wind. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand, and immediately felt the temperature drop. The hallway was dark and narrow, lined with broken furniture and scattered debris. My footsteps echoed unnervingly, each one reminding me how alone I was. The blueprint from the journal led me through a maze of corridors. Most of the rooms I passed were empty, filled only with dust and rusted equipment. But then, I found it. A heavy steel door with a biohazard symbol painted on it. The door was slightly open, revealing a staircase leading downward. The air grew colder as I descended. The walls were damp, and faint sounds echoed from below, dripping water, the scurrying of rats, and something else. A low, almost imperceptible hum. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in what appeared to be a laboratory. Broken glass littered the counters, and ancient machines loomed in the corners like forgotten sentinels. In the center of the room was a cylindrical tank, large enough to fit a person. The glass was cracked, and the liquid inside had long since dried, leaving behind dark stains. Pinned to a nearby corkboard were more photographs. Some showed experiments in progress, people in lab coats working with strange, glowing substances. Others were darker, showing distorted shapes that didn't look entirely human. I noticed a journal lying open on a desk, its pages yellowed with time. The entry at the top was dated just days before the lab was abandoned. "We've failed. The compound is alive. It's adapting, spreading. If anyone finds this, leave now. Don't touch anything. Don't stay." As I read, the humming sound grew louder. My flashlight flickered, and a deep chill swept through the room. I turned, and for the first time, I noticed the shadows weren't behaving as they should. They moved against the light, twisting and stretching unnaturally. Then, from the far corner of the room, I heard it, a wet, shuffling noise like something dragging itself across the floor. The sound grew louder, wet and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as I swung the flashlight toward the source. In the corner, a figure shifted. At first I thought it was just debris, a pile of rags or machinery parts, but then it moved. The thing was human-shaped, but barely. Its skin was translucent and stretched tight over a bony frame, veins pulsing with an unnatural glow. Its arms were elongated, ending in sharp claw-like fingers. Worst of all were its eyes, milky white, with no pupils, staring blankly in my direction. The journal's words echoed in my head. The compound is alive. It's adapting. It wasn't just an experiment gone wrong, it was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. My stomach churned as the creature let out a guttural noise, half growl, half whimper, and began dragging itself toward me. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a broken chair. My flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that made the creature's movements even more horrifying. It was slow but deliberate, its milky eyes fixed on me, as if it knew exactly who I was. I scanned the room desperately for an escape. There was a door on the far side, slightly ajar, but between me and it was the creature. My heart pounded as I made a decision. Run. I bolted toward the door, skirting around the creature as it let out a high-pitched shriek. Its claws swiped at my leg, grazing the fabric of my jeans but missing flesh. I slammed through the door and found myself in another hallway, this one darker and narrower than the last. Behind me, the creature's shuffling grew faster. It was chasing me now, its screeches echoing through the tight corridor. I ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. Doors blurred past me, all locked or blocked by debris. Finally, I saw it. A ladder leading up to a hatch. Adrenaline surged through me as I climbed, ignoring the searing pain in my hands from the rusted rungs. I threw myself against the hatch, pushing with all my strength, and it burst open, flooding the corridor with light. I crawled out into the open air, gasping and shaking. The hatch led to a small clearing in the woods near the industrial park. I glanced back, expecting the creature to follow, but the hatch remained still. The hum I'd heard earlier was gone, replaced by the eerie silence of the forest. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but then I noticed something on my hand. A faint, glowing residue where the creature's claw had grazed me. It pulsed faintly, almost like a heartbeat. I sat in the clearing for what felt like hours, staring at the faintly glowing mark on my hand. It pulsed rhythmically, almost like it was alive. My thoughts raced. What had I done? What had I let out of that lab? The journal's warnings came flooding back. The compound is alive. Prolonged exposure leads to changes. I tried wiping it off, but the glow didn't fade. It seemed to sink deeper into my skin, as if it were becoming a part of me. I didn't dare go back to the lab, but I couldn't go home either. Not like this. What if the residue was contagious? What if I was bringing something dangerous into the world? Desperate for answers, I returned to the journal. The pages described experiments with a bioluminescent compound, something that could enhance human abilities, but at a terrible cost. Subjects exposed to the compound experienced rapid physical changes, their bodies adapting unnaturally to their environments. The final stages of exposure were horrific. One phrase stuck out. Containment is no longer possible. If the compound breaches the surface, it will spread unchecked. The glowing mark on my hand pulsed again, as if to remind me that I was now part of this nightmare. I decided to stay in the woods overnight, far from anyone else. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's milky stare, heard its guttural shrieks. And then, in the early hours of the morning, I felt it. The glow on my hand began to spread. Tiny veins of light crept up my wrist, disappearing beneath my sleeve. Panic set in. Was I becoming like it? Was the compound already changing me? By dawn, the glow had spread further, winding up my arm in intricate vein-like patterns. It didn't hurt, not physically, but I felt a deep unease, like something foreign was taking root inside me. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed help, but I couldn't go to the authorities. What would I even say? That my neighbor left me a note, and now I was infected with some kind of glowing residue from a secret lab? They'd think I was insane, or worse, they'd try to cover it up, just like whoever abandoned the lab in the first place. I thought about Mr. Grayson. He must have known about the lab, about the compound. Was that why he left me the note? Did he think I could stop this? The weight of it all pressed down on me as I realized I might be the only one who could make sure this nightmare didn't spread further. I went back to the lab. The idea terrified me, but the journal had mentioned a containment protocol, a failsafe that could destroy the compound for good. If I could activate it, maybe I could stop the spread. I brought the journal, a flashlight, and a crowbar, knowing I might not make it out. The lab was just as I'd left it, dark and cold, the hum of machinery barely audible. The creature was gone, but its presence lingered in the air, an oppressive weight that made my skin crawl. I followed the blueprint to a control room near the back of the lab. The door was locked, but the crowbar did the trick. Inside, I found a console covered in switches and dials, all coated in a thin layer of dust. The journal had instructions for activating the failsafe. It was simple enough. Flip the red switch, input the sequence written in the margins, and the entire lab would be incinerated. But there was a catch. The journal warned that the failsafe couldn't be activated remotely. Someone would have to stay behind to ensure the system worked. My hand hovered over the switch as I considered my options. If I left now, I could try to find someone else to deal with this. But what if the compound spread before I could get help? What if the creature wasn't the only one of its kind? I looked down at my arm. The glow was brighter now, the veins pulsing steadily. I could feel it in my chest, in my heartbeat. The compound was already inside me. There was no escaping it. I took a deep breath and flipped the switch. The console roared to life, red lights flashing and alarms blaring. The countdown began. 10 minutes until total destruction. I sprinted back toward the exit, my heart pounding as the lab shook around me. Pipes burst, spewing steam into the corridors, and the walls groaned under the pressure. As I climbed the ladder to the surface, I felt the heat rising behind me. I threw myself onto the ground just as a deafening explosion ripped through the earth. Flames shot into the sky, and the ground trembled as the lab collapsed in on itself, burying whatever horrors it held. I don't know if I stopped it or if I just unleashed something even worse. All I know is that the compound is out there, and it might already be spreading. What would you do if you found yourself in my position? Let me know in the comments. I don't think I can face this alone.